So this is the lecture on sex offenders, typology, evaluation, and treatment. And what we're going to do in this lecture is we're first going to talk about sex crimes and what sex crimes are by definition. We're going to talk about two different types of sex offenders. That would be child molesters and rapists, and I'm going to present a typology for each, and we'll talk on the next slide actually about what a typology is. We're also going to talk about management, evaluation, and treatment of sex offenders as well, and there are a number of videos for you to view on Canvas related to this module. So let's talk about what a typology is first. So a typology is simply an analysis or classification based on types or categories. So a lot of what we do in psychology is categorizing, organizing behavior, and that's essentially what a typology is. So a typology is useful in classifying a wide range of behaviors into different categories, and putting behaviors and creating classifications for different behaviors is a process that enables research, assessment, prevention, treatment, and policy planning to take place. So a typology, a good example of a typology would be your status here at the university. Are you a freshman, sophomore, senior, or junior? That's essentially a typology, right? So you're in one of those four categories, or maybe you're a super senior. I don't know. Hopefully not. But you're in one of those categories, and by placing you in those categories, which, you know, the designation is based on how many credit hours you've completed at Montclair State, not how long you've been here, but really how many credit hours you've completed. That allows us to very quickly make assessments about you. I know, for example, if you are a junior, I know approximately how many credits you've taken. If I know your major, I know which courses you probably have left to take in the major, and I also can quickly tell how long you're going to be here at Montclair State. So that's an example of a typology and why it might be useful. Okay, and we'll talk about typology of sex offenders here shortly, starting with child molesters. But first, let's talk about sex crimes or sex offenses. And what are they, right? So here's a very broad definition. Any sexual behavior with a child, a non-consenting adult, or anyone who is unable to give consent due to physical condition. All right. So, of course, different jurisdictions define sex crimes and sex offenses in slightly different ways, but what they all have in common is the issue of consent, right? So any sexual behavior with a child, so the idea here is that a child cannot give consent, even though a child may say, I want to do something, or even an adolescent, a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old says, I want to do something, he's my boyfriend, I love him. Even though they're consenting in a way, they're not legally consenting because society believes that they lack the capacity, they lack the experience, the authority to make reasoned decisions that are in their best interests. In other words, we believe that children don't really know what's in their best interest. That's why they're under adult supervision. So the same thing holds true with sexual behavior. That's why we have the age of consent, which in New Jersey is 16. So that's something to think about. But certainly non-consenting adult, that's pretty self-explanatory. Anyone who is unable to give consent due to physical condition. It could be they're blackout drunk, or they are physically disabled or mentally disabled, and they can't give consent. There are certainly gray areas when it comes to physical condition consent. So when we're talking about people who are drunk or under the influence of drugs, there's kind of a fine line there. Certainly when people are under the influence of drugs and alcohol, their judgment may be impaired. Does that mean that they can't give consent? I would argue that it's really, if you have a case where the police are investigating a sex crime and it involves someone who's under the influence of drugs or alcohol, it's really going to come down to the specific circumstances in the case. Who is the other person involved in the sexual behavior? Were they drunk or under the influence of drugs? Was it at a party? There's so many different things that the prosecutors are going to consider when determining A, whether a sex crime was committed, and B, whether they think they can prove it in court. So, again, kind of a fine line sometimes. All right, so sex crimes also include crimes of, penetration, contact such as fondling, and crimes of non-contact such as exhibitionism or voyeurism. So crimes of penetration, that is pretty self-explanatory. But it's not necessarily what you think. So, for example, in the laws regarding child sexual abuse, if you put your hand, if you touch a child's genitals, that could be considered penetration. It doesn't have to be literal penetration per se. So I know a former prosecutor in Passaic County, actually Joe Del Russo, who teaches in the program, in the child advocacy program, and disturbing the labia. He said that's the definition of penetration in New Jersey. In any case, fondling, there's something called frauderism. Frauderism is where people rub their genitals against other people in public and usually in very crowded places. That's a crime of contact. Non-contact, such as exhibitionism, exposing yourself to unwilling, unparticipating people, and voyeurism, spying on people while they're getting dressed or having sex or whatever. So those are crimes of non-contact. A lot of these crimes fall into the category of paraphilias. So a paraphilia is not a legal term. It's a psychological term, and it refers to basically, it's a broad term that refers to someone who has a kind of a maladaptive sexual behavior, right? I don't want to say deviant because that's not really a social term, and that's not really a psychological term or a legal term. Deviant behavior is really kind of defined by society. So there's a lot of stuff that is quote unquote deviant that's perfectly legal. But a paraphilia is a clinical diagnosis that refers to kind of a maladaptive behavior. So typically, a behavior will reach the clinical threshold when that behavior interferes with the person's life, their work, their family. They have an emotional attachment to the behavior, things like that. So a paraphilia might include things that are illegal, such as exhibitionism and voyeurism, which again, depending on the context, may or may not be illegal. But a paraphilia, again, is kind of a catch-all term to describe many of these behaviors. So crimes related to the production and consumption, possession of certain types of pornography, especially child pornography. So sex crimes, of course, could include child pornography, but also depictions of bestiality and other things like that. All right. So who are sex offenders? And the short answer is sex offenders could be anybody. They vary significantly in age, and they represent all races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic classes. They're found among the poor, they're found among the rich, the powerful, the Catholic, the Protestant, the Jewish, the Muslim. Sex offenders basically are found in all strata of society. Most are not mentally ill in the traditional sense. When we talk about someone who's mentally ill, they're usually suffering from some type of mental disease or mental defect. And they may or may not know what they're doing is wrong, or may be unable to control their behavior. So most sex offenders are not mentally ill, at least in the traditional sense. And they engage in their behavior for diverse and complex reasons. So what that means is that sexual gratification is not always the motive. Just like rape, when we talk about rape is largely a crime about power and control. It's sexual gratification is typically not the primary motivation of the rapist. So there are a lot of different reasons that sex offenders might engage in the behavior that they do. And we're going to talk about that. I want to briefly talk about NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. So this organization opposes age as the basis for minors to engage in sexual relations. So basically, NAMBLA is comprised of a group of adult men, and they argue that it's perfectly normal and natural for adult men to have sexual relationship with adolescent boys. And that's a particular type of paraphilia they're called pederasts. I believe there's a equivalent. There's another term called hebephile, but we won't talk about that right now. But anyway, NAMBLA really kind of has this. They have this organization and they have a website. They're headquartered in New York City, but they have all types of justifications for their behaviors. They argue that it's healthy for the adolescents to engage in sex with men. They're teaching them it's a loving relationship. The Greeks did it. So they have all these justifications and rationalizations for the behaviors, and that's common about sex offenders. They think that they really rationalize their behavior and justify it and believe they're not harming the child in doing what they're doing. So let's talk about pedophilia for a moment. The clinical definition of a pedophile really is a person who has a primary sexual attraction to prepubescent children, either male or female. So they're sexually attracted to children. And this is a permanent, stable trait. This isn't a passing fad. This isn't a phase they're going through. This is a lifelong, stable, permanent attraction to children. It's a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, but it is not a crime. Okay, so pedophilia is not a crime because pedophilia is a psychological term, not a legal term. There is nothing illegal about being sexually attracted to a child. You may feel that it's perverse, but the law does not punish people based on their feelings. The law punishes people based on their actions. So you can be a pedophile, and you're not a child. You could be someone who doesn't molest children, and therefore not a criminal. So if you're a pedophile and you molest a child, that makes you a child molester and a criminal. If you're a pedophile and you don't molest children, that makes you someone who is sexually attracted to children, but you're not a criminal. I think you get the distinction. So people often talk about pedophilia as a legal term. What was he convicted of? Pedophilia. No, people aren't convicted of pedophilia. So even in law enforcement, you see this term misused frequently. We don't really know why some people are pedophiles and some people aren't. Just like we don't know why some people are psychopaths and some people are not. But we don't know why some people are straight and some people are gay. So pedophilia is really a mystery why some people are sexually attracted to children, but it must be a real terrible, curse to live under. Imagine being sexually attracted to the opposite sex or the same sex, but it's illegal to, have a relationship with people of that sex. Now, I know that gay Americans have been, persecuted, and sodomy. There were sodomy laws, and gay sex was illegal, and things like that. And that in some parts of the world, homosexuality is punished much more severely than that. But in American society, pedophilia is really kind of in a league of its own. Certainly, I'm not comparing the two, homosexuality and pedophilia, but my point is that we don't know why some people are pedophiles, but it is a permanent, stable trait, and I don't think that these people have a choice in who they are sexually attracted to, which for them is very unfortunate. They have a choice about the behavior that they want to engage in or how they want to manage their attraction, but it's not like people wake up in the morning and say, hey, I want to be a pedophile, I want to have sex with a child today. I don't think it's quite how that works. So just something to think about. Child molesters, so these are the criminals, right? Are often, but not always, pedophiles. So there are some people who molest children who are not sexually attracted to children. But child molesters really are comprised of anyone who sexually assaults a child, regardless of their motivation. And that will become more clear when I start talking about the typology in the next slide. But regardless of their motivation, they usually use persuasion or manipulation or sometimes physical force to perpetrate their crimes. So in terms of child molesters, I'm going to present a typology that's actually was developed by the FBI. And we're going to talk about the preferential child molester, the situational child molester, the organized, and the disorganized. All right? So let's talk about the preferential first. The preferential, this is your pedophile. They have a primary sexual attraction to children. So they may abuse children for many years. Molesting children is a sexual lifestyle, and they often create complex facades to cover up their crimes. So they may become a priest, or they may become a teacher or a camp counselor, or they may situate themselves in a place where they have access to children. And that's what we mean by creating a complex facade to cover up their crimes. So these people are often, predators, but they're often, skillful, they're careful. And we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about organized and disorganized. But just for now, know that the preferential child molester is the same as the pedophile. And you can contrast that with the situational child molester, who has a primary sexual attraction to adult females. So they're not pedophiles. Okay, they do not have a primary sexual attraction to children. And the question is, well, then why would they molest a child? Well, their involvement, their behavior often develops as a result of their responses to external stress and situational difficulties. The victims are usually female, and incest offenders usually fall into this category. So, just for example, let's take a hypothetical scenario where there's a guy who is an alcoholic, and he has stepkids at home, and he's just an angry person. He's angry at the world. He's angry at his wife, whatever. And he gets drunk and he molests his stepdaughter because she's there, right? It makes him feel powerful. It makes him feel like he's in control of something. Or maybe he's thinking he's getting back at his wife or whatever. So again, he's not necessarily sexually attracted to the child, but that's his motivation. It's derived from external stress or situational difficulties. That is the difference between the preferential and the organized child molester. Or I'm sorry, the preferential and the situational child molester. Now let's talk about the organized and the disorganized. So the organized child molester, these tend to be pedophiles who have specific tastes in children, which I mean is they like children of a certain age or a certain hair color. Their crimes are well organized, thoughtfully planned. They tend to be patient and calculating, and they go to great lengths to conceal their crimes. So in other words, they're cautious, they're calculating, they're careful. These are your organized criminals, and we talked a little bit about organized criminals when we talked about profiling. Same thing applies for child molesters. Your disorganized child molesters tend to be, but are not always, situational child molesters, and their crimes are characterized by lack of planning and forethought, and their crimes tend to be based on impulse. Now these are it's generally believed to be the most dangerous of the child molesters, the disorganized. These are the people who, because they're disorganized, they will just kind of commit a crime of opportunity. They'll see a child who's by herself, they'll snatch her off the street, they'll molest her, and they haven't thought things through. They don't have a plan. They panic. I've got a witness here, what do I do? They panic, they kill the child and dump the child, and there are many examples of that, unfortunately. But that's what happens when you're disorganized, and that is why disorganized child molesters are believed to be among the most dangerous to the welfare of the child. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you this kind of 4-factor model here, this multi-dimensional model of child molesters. And you're going to see this on the exam, and I'm going to ask you questions about it. But you've got your 4 quadrants here. So quadrant A, Quadrant A is your preferential organized child molester. Quadrant B is your preferential disorganized child molester. Quadrant C is your organized situational child molester, and Quadrant D is your disorganized situational child molester. Right? So your preferential organized, this is your pedophiles who are highly organized. This is your pedophiles who are disorganized. These are your situational child molesters that are disorganized, and these are your organized child molesters, your situational child molesters that are organized, which is probably pretty rare. All right, so on the exam, I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to give you a short fact pattern about a child molester and their motivation and what they did, and I'm going to ask you to correctly place them in one of these corresponding quadrants. And this model was developed by a man named Ken Lanning, who was a profiler with the FBI, and that's kind of where this comes from. At least to my knowledge, that's where this typology comes from. All right, so that concludes our kind of small section here on child molesters. There's obviously much more we could talk about, but we're going to stop here, and in the next lecture, we're going to talk about rapists.